The Book of Esther, chapter 9. For in the 12th month, on the 13th day of the month, which is Adar, the letters written by the king arrived. In that day the adversaries of the Jews perished, for no one resisted through fear of them. For the chiefs of the satraps and the princes and the royal scribes honored the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai lay upon them. For the order of the king was in force, that he should be celebrated in all the kingdom. And in the city Shushan the Jews slew 500 men, both Pharsanes and Delphon, and Phasga, and Pharadatha, and Berea, and Sabaka, and Marmasima, and Ruphaeus, and Arsaeus, and Zabutheus, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Amadathas the Bugaean, the enemy of the Jews, and they plundered their property on the same day. And the number of them that perished in Shushan was rendered to the king. And the king said to Esther, The Jews have slain 500 men in the city Shushan. And how, thinkest thou, have they used them in the rest of the country? What then dost thou yet ask, that it may be done for thee? And Esther said to the king, Let it be granted to the Jews so to treat them tomorrow, as to hand the 10 sons of Haman. And he permitted it to be so done, and he gave up to the Jews of the city the bodies of the sons of Haman to hang. And the Jews assembled in Shushan on the 14th day of Adar, and slew 300 men, but plundered no property. And the rest of the Jews who were in the kingdom assembled, and helped one another, and obtained rest from their enemies, for they destroyed 15,000 of them on the 13th day of Adar, but took no spoil. And they rested on the 14th of the same month, and kept it as a day of rest, with joy and gladness. And the Jews in the city Shushan assembled also on the 14th day and rested, and they kept also the 15th with joy and gladness. On this account then it is that the Jews dispersed in every foreign land keep the 14th of Adar as a holy day with joy, sending portions each to his neighbor. And Mordecai wrote these things in a book, and sent them to the Jews, as many as were in the kingdom of Artaxerxes, both them that were near, and them that were afar off, to establish these as joyful days, and to keep the 14th and 15th of Adar. For on these days the Jews obtained rest from their enemies. And as to the month which was Adar, in which a change was made for them, from mourning to joy, and from sorrow to a good day, to spend the whole of it in good days of feasting and gladness, sending portions to the friends and to the poor. And the Jews consented to this accordingly, as Mordecai wrote to them, showing how Haman the son of Amadathas the Macedonian fought against them, how he made a decree and cast lots to destroy them utterly. Also how he went in to the king, telling him to hang Mordecai. But all the calamities he tried to bring upon the Jews came upon himself, and he was hanged, and his children. Therefore these days were called Purim, because of the lots. For in the language they are called Purim, because of the words of this letter, and because of all they suffered on this account, and all that happened to them. And Mordecai established it, and the Jews took upon themselves, and upon their seed, and upon those that were joined to them, to observe it. Neither would they on any account behave differently, But these days were to be a memorial kept in every generation, and city, and family, and province. And these days of the Purim, said they, shall be kept forever, and their memorial shall not fail in any generation. And Queen Esther, the daughter of Aminadab, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote all that they had done, and a confirmation of the letter of Purim. And Mordecai and Esther the queen appointed a fast for themselves privately, even at that time, also having formed their plan against their own health. And Esther established it by a command forever, and it was written for memorial. Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome to Esther chapter 9, in which there are 32 verses, and the title of this video is Who was the author of the book of Esther? Who wrote the book of Esther? So let's cover these verses. We've got a lot to cover in this video. Starting in verse 1, there's an addition of, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. Verse 2, another addition, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. In verse 4, there's a big difference. It reads, for the order of the king was in force, that he should be celebrated in all the kingdom. Verses, for Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. So I hope you can see the difference there. The order of the king was enforced, that he, Mordecai, should be celebrated in all the kingdom. There is no mention of the command in the Masoretic. It's just that Mordecai was the focus in the Masoretic, and he became famous, more famous. So it happened naturally, just became famous, but in the Septuagint, his fame grew because of the command, and perhaps Elohim as well was a part of that, a big part of that. Verse 5, an addition of, thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. That was added. Verse 7 to 9, talking about the identity of Haman. I should say, no, it's not the identity. It's the names of the sons, the 10 sons of Haman. Now, notice in the Septuagint, they're very Greek-sounding names. It is written in Greek after all, but just looking over them, Pharsanes, Dalphon, Phasga, Faradatha, Barea, Sarbaka, Marmasima, Rufeus, Arceus, Sabutheus. In the Masoretic, they sound very much either Persian or Middle Eastern. Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspata, I should say Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, Vajazatha. I mean, those are very Middle Eastern sounding, in my opinion. Whereas Greek sounding names usually end with a US, like Perseus, Hercules, and so on. Well, that doesn't have the US, but you know the names. In any case, verse 10, we have an omission of the Bugayan, interestingly. And a big difference, it reads, they plundered their property on the same day. So they did, in fact, plunder the property of the 10 sons of Haman. In the Masoretic, they did not. It says and the spoil laid they not their hand. They didn't touch it. So two different accounts here. In verse 13, we read, Esther requested to hand the 10 sons of Haman over. So give us the 10 sons. Versus let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. So they haven't been hung yet. In the Masoretic, in the Septuagint, they've already been hung. She just wants the bodies, essentially. Or they've been executed. They've been slew, now they're going to be hung to be displayed. I think it's saying the same thing in both, but they're not saying that they're going to hang their bodies up in verse 13, not until verse 14, where it says that they hung them. And it reads in verse 14, and he gave up to the Jews of the city the bodies of the sons of Haman. Verses, and the decree was given at Shushan. So they were handed over. They hanged the sons up in the Masoretic. They were also hung in the Septuagint in any case. Verse 16 now. Significant difference. It says the Jews helped one another. They helped one another versus they had stood for their lives. So it's not that every man for themselves in the Masoretic. No, they were united and even assisting one another in the Septuagint. They, meaning the Jews, destroyed 15,000 of them, of their enemies, versus 75,000. So a discrepancy of 60,000. Verse 17, joy versus feasting. Verse 19, the Jews dispersed in every foreign land versus the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns. So these are the Jews dispersed throughout the empire of Persia. It says holy day versus good day, and the Greek reads good day, Yom Tov, which makes more sense in the Masoretic since human beings cannot make a day holy. Only Elohim can do that. Only the Elohim of Israel can do that. Truly make a day holy and set apart, because it is set apart for his purposes and for whatever he wants us to do on those days to commemorate or to perform. Verse 20, there's an omission of in a book versus it says letters, so that's the implication. They were written in letters. Verse 21, there's an omission of as joyful days. Verse 22, another omission, for. So the word for is omitted, which gives us the connector between these dates, 14th and 15th, saying basically the rationale of keeping these days is because of the following of what happened in the history of Israel. It says feastings versus weddings. Or I should say the footnote is weddings. So it says good days of feasting, and the footnote would be good days of wedding, of being wed. So they would perhaps conduct marriage ceremonies traditionally on this day, perhaps. I didn't fact check that, but that could be a possibility. There's no omission in verse 22, which reads, which was Adar, in which a change was made for them. So again, stressing that this occurred in the month of Adar. Very important as to the timing. Verse 24, big difference. It reads, the Macedonian versus the Agagite. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. An addition of the enemy of all the Jews. And now in verse 25, a big difference again. Also he went into the king, telling him, this is Haman who went into the king, telling him to hang Mordecai. But in the Masoretic, they identify this individual as Esther. So Esther came before the king and commanded letters that his wicked device. Okay, so we can see it doesn't make much sense. Why is Esther going in? But they're trying to spin it in a way to make it make sense, but it sounds more confusing, quite frankly. Verse 26, we have an omission of for in their language, they are called Purim. And going back to verse 25, it's just more straightforward, so it's overcomplicating a simple verse. Just straightforward verse, okay? Continuing in verse 26, and because of all they suffered on this account, and all that happened to them. So that's what it says in the Septuagint. In the Masoretic, it reads, "And of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them." So the Septuagint is saying, basically, these days were called Purim because the Jews suffered on this account, because of the letters of Haman. Versus these days are called Purim because of the words of this letter, which the Jews had witnessed. So they only witnessed these things. They weren't suffering or were persecuted. It can be taken in the wrong way, interpreted in the wrong way. Verse 27 to 28 says, "Mordecai established it." But this is, just to be honest and transparent, this is only the translator's interpretation, the one who translated the Septuagint to English, because this was inserted. It's not part of the original text. Neither would they, on any account, behave differently, versus as it should not fail. We have a significant difference of an addition of according to their writing and according to their appointed time every year. Verse 28, there's an omission of "shall be kept forever." So this is to be a perpetual statute for the people of Israel, and even by extension the Persian Empire, those living under its authority. In verse 29, it talks about how Esther is not the daughter of Mordecai. That is often an error people make, where they read it this way: Esther the queen, the daughter of Aminadab and Mordecai. So Aminadab is a woman, that's the assumption, and Mordecai is the father. No, that's not what it's saying. You have to recognize that this comma, this punctuation, is a separator, a divider between Esther and Mordecai, this one, the second one. And Queen Esther, who is the daughter of Aminadab, also Mordecai, so basically it's saying Esther and Mordecai wrote all they had done. So that's the answer to the video's question. So they wrote this together collaboratively. This book of Esther we're reading right now, that we've been narrating, verses they wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim. So Septuagint is saying in black and white explicitly, Queen Esther and Mordecai are the authors of this book. They are the original writers. They penned this book. They inscribed. They were the inscribers, the scribes. Versus they wrote something, we don't know what. They wrote with all authority. Whenever they would write, they just would write with authority. They wrote, and their authority was recognized by the Jews and the Persian Empire, the kingdom of Persia. And then it reads here, in the confirmation of the letter of Purim, verses they also wrote to confirm the second letter of Purim. In verse 30, we are ignoring that. In verse 31, it reads, "And Mordecai and Esther the queen appointed a fast for themselves privately, even at that time, also having formed their plan against their own health." So they had a private fast. They fasted privately. It wasn't a public fast, although people did find out about it. But they fasted for themselves first, in order for them to seek guidance, to humble themselves, for spiritual help, because they're afflicting their souls. That's the common thing to do. Verses they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. Okay, so that's an interesting difference. Verse 32, an omission of, "And Esther established it by a command," and this is the omission, "forever." Again, reiterating this is a commandment, perpetual commandment, not from Elohim directly, but from Esther, who was, let's be a little honest here, and not a little, but let's just see it for what it is. Esther was inspired. She was moved. She was put in this time by Elohim for the purpose of saving the nation of Israel, and so the people, the Jewish people. So we could say that, she was inspired by the Ruach HaKodesh. She was moved to establish this command forever. Not saying this is, directly from Elohim and from his own mouth, but he used Esther as a vehicle, as a vessel, to establish this command forever. Now, I'm not equating this with the Leviticus 23 feasts, but this is to be a command forever, and it was established by Esther. Notice it says Esther, not Hashem or the Elohim of Israel. It's by Esther. But we can also recognize her inspiration and how Adonai had placed her there for that moment in time, that specific time, specific place, specific reason. Versus Esther confirmed Purim, but not as a command, more so that they are historically accurate and true. So a lot of people, even myself, before I was convinced to celebrate Purim, I thought, okay, it's historical, it did happen, but I shouldn't keep it. I don't have to. It's not mandated. But I moved, especially in these times of increased anti-Semitism and Jewish hate, persecution of the Jews for no reason, just made up reasons and lies, that this is more relevant than ever these days of the festival of Hanukkah and the festival of Purim. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. Till next time, I bid you all Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum, Eirini Mazisu, Pax Vobiscum, Aramesh Ba To Bashad. Peace be unto you, and Maranatha.